if the government just gave every citizen a cash payment paid right into their bank account every month, regardless of whether they're rich or poor? That's the basic premise behind the universal basic income, which major political parties from Canada to the United Kingdom to Namibia are now considering adopting. In a recent referendum, however, voters in Switzerland rejected a proposal to bring in a universal basic income by a 3-to-1 margin. Joining me to debate the pros and cons of such a measure and to discuss whether it's ever likely to happen are Senator Andrea Caroni, Vice President of the Free Democratic Party in Switzerland, who campaigned against universal basic income in the referendum. He's in Bern, and here in the studio, Vox.com's Dylan Matthews, an award-winning US journalist who's been writing in favour of it for several years now. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me in the arena. Andrea Caroni, why do you think the Swiss overwhelmingly voted against a universal basic income, which has the support of economists on left and right? What was the number one argument you used to campaign against it?
This was a solution, a revolution that actually no one really needed. Switzerland has a very far-reaching welfare state. So this solution would have meant money for those who could work, but just prefer to spend the time in the swimming pool instead of working.
Dylan Matthews, why do you support a measure which gives money to people who just get to stay in their swimming pool and not get a job?
Well, I think part of the reason is that we have experimental evidence suggesting that isn't what happens. There were a number of trials of a form of basic income known as a negative income tax in the United States and Canada in the 70s. The best one of these was an experiment called Mincome in Canada, and it found that the only groups that worked less were teenagers and women who had recently had children. And so people would take time off work as a form of maternity leave or would focus more on their studies as teenagers. And I think that might seem counterintuitive that you give people money and they don't choose to work less. But I think in practice, work gives people meaning, provides a structure for their life, provides a way to connect with their coworkers. And the role that the income was playing for people was more as a safety net.
So it's a supplement rather than a substitute?
It's a supplement rather than a substitute. And I think in most places it is set at a level that is too low for certainly for a middle-class existence and usually around the poverty line.
So what's your main argument in favour? Why do you think it should be brought in? The number one reason there should be universal basic income across?
I think the main reason, and I usually argue for this in the context of the United States, is that I think it's very important to have a cash safety net that is extensive and that is universal. That we've found that programs that are means tested and programs that are in kind, that only give food or housing or one good, can sometimes fall short. In the U.S., we have a problem where many people have food stamps, but will sell food stamps if they're desperately poor for cash. This obviously depends on the country you're in, but I think in the U.S. and in Canada and in a lot of the Anglophone countries, there really is a lack of that form of safety net at the bottom end.
Andrea Caroni, what about this poverty argument? People say, the Nobel Prize winner for economics last year, Professor Angus Deaton, he supports universal basic income as a way of stemming inequality. He says we live in an age of rising inequality. The basic income is the neatest, cleanest, simplest way of ending or at least reducing poverty, is it not?
My colleague just mentioned the function as a safety net. Now, it depends on the country where you come from, how you see it. But in Switzerland, we have this safety net. We have a means-tested social security system, which gives you about as much money as the universal or unconditional income would have given you, which is about $2,500 per adult person per month. If you earn 2,500 Swiss francs a month in a hard-working job on a construction site, would you do the same if you got that money for free on the first day of the month? That was our thought. Now, I see other countries, they have more problems with inequality and with their social net, security net. I suggest they improve those systems instead of going for this radical version, which gives money to a lot of people who don't need it and who takes away the incentive to work for a lot of people who actually could work.
So one effect of that universality, however, is that it functions as a wage floor and improves the bargaining power of many workers. So you could argue that it decreases the motive to work for this construction worker. What it could also do is let that worker go to their boss and say, well, it used to be that if I did not work at all, I would have to go on welfare, I would be stigmatized, I would be sort of marginalized in my society. Now we have a system where if I don't work, I have this to fall back on. It's a universal benefit that everyone gets. It's not thought of as welfare. And I think that greatly improves their bargaining power. And in part because people are getting this money and they're spending this money and they're engaging in the economy through that way, employers will still need work. And I would suspect that if you gave this a try, and there are a number of experiments worldwide that are going to test this, you would see a bargaining up of wages for exactly that reason, because workers have another option.
I mean, it certainly increases the bargaining power. Now, but if you do the math, you'll see it can't work for society as a whole who also has to pay for it. If you take, for example, a hairdresser, maybe in Switzerland, that person, let's just say, it earns those 2,500 Swiss francs a month. Now, the same person gets that money on the first of the month without having done any work at all. Now, of course, in order to engage for a whole month of work as a hairdresser, that same person would want to have an additional 2,500 francs, which was the salary she got before. Now, this person would need a total of 5,000 Swiss francs for the same job. 2,000 she got, 2,000 for the work, 2,500 for the work, which means that your haircut would be double the price. If you do this across the board for all professions, you see this increase in all salaries and all prices. So after that, you would have to increase the basic income by factor 2. And so it's a negative spiral, which can't work out because someone has to pay it.
This is the inflation argument against basic income, which has some intuitive appeal. I don't think there's a lot of evidence in contemporary society that inflation is a function of government spending as opposed to the policies of central banks. And so I think if you had a situation like that in the United States, I would expect the Fed to step in and try to put a tamp on things.
What about the general affordability argument that Andrea makes?
Absolutely.
You know, in a country like the United States, your country, the cost could run into trillions of dollars to give everyone, say, 10 grand a year, $10,000 a year. Are people who don't like higher taxes really going to buy into the argument of paying higher taxes in order for everyone to have this basic income?
It's definitely a major political struggle, and I think it's a greater struggle in the United States than a lot of countries. For one thing, we don't have a welfare state like Switzerland has, or even like the United Kingdom has. And for another thing, we have a strong stigma about receiving benefits without working that I think is less potent in other countries. But I would encourage viewers who are interested in this to look at a report that the British think tank Compass put out recently, laying out a bunch of very specific plans for a basic income. Where I agree with the senator is that I think the dollar amounts or franc amounts proposed in Switzerland were extremely high for a proposal. Compass's report puts out more modest estimates and also a plan to pay for it through adjusting income taxes. And what they find is that you can finance it with top rates of about 48–50%, which by U.S. standards is quite high, by European standards is fairly typical.
You wrote a piece for Vox headlined, "Basic Income Advocates Lost the Battle in Switzerland. They're winning the war." How so? Where are they winning the war?
So I think I've been following basic income since about 2006. The past 3 years have been just remarkable in the growth of the idea. And I think that's in large part attributable to the referendum in Switzerland, that immediately after the referendum was approved in 2013, Fox News of all places did a segment on it. The New York Times had coverage.
Where does it happen in practice? Are there places in the world where it's actually happening?
There are about four to five actual experiments that are going down now, in part because of this movement and the interest being generated by it. There's one in Oakland that a venture capital firm in the United States is doing. There's one in Utrecht in the Netherlands that the government is doing. There's one in Finland that will launch next year. There's one in Ontario, the largest province of Canada, containing Toronto. And there's one in Kenya.
So you're optimistic about the future of basic income?
I'm optimistic, and I'm very curious to see what happens. And I think these studies are better designed than some past ones. I like to think that I make decisions based on the evidence. If in 5 years these studies all come back and say that society as we know it would be destroyed, I think I'll be agreeing with the senator, but I'm curious.
We're out of time. Let me give the last word to Andrea Caroni in Bern. Andrea, Switzerland rejected the basic income. Do you think it's bad for Switzerland, or are you saying it's bad for the whole world? Would you accept that in some of these other places, in Holland, Finland, Oakland, wherever, it could be a success?
Now, those experiments, they have very different parameters than we would have had here. For example, I think the one in Oakland is targeted to a rather poor population, or sometimes they have very low amounts. The way it was proposed in Switzerland would have destroyed a lot of our social and economic tissue.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.